Hey guys, and welcome back. Tonight we're settling in with a story about some of history's most overlooked women. The ones who got the title, the crown, sometimes the castle, but never the actual power. The forgotten queens, if you will. So grab a blanket, turn down the brightness on your screen, and let's wander through the oddly uneventful, yet strangely fascinating lives of the women who married kings, but never ruled beside them. Now, when we talk about queens, the image that usually comes to mind is someone powerful, maybe a Cleopatra type, or Elizabeth the Furor ruling England with a ruff the size of a satellite dish. But the reality is, most queens in European history were more like very fancy background characters. They were there, they were important enough to be painted in a stiff portrait, and then they just kind of faded out of the story. Let's start by floating back to medieval France, where one of the earliest forgotten queens was Blanche of Navarre. Blanche was married to King Charles the Thor of France in the 14th century. She was 18. He was, well, also a king. That was pretty much the main qualification. Their marriage was arranged, obviously, because why let love or personality get in the way of international politics? Charles, by the way, is sometimes nicknamed the Fair, which sounds flattering until you remember that medieval nicknames were about as creative as a kindergarten crayon drawing. Blonde hair, you're the Fair. Big nose, congrats, you're the Bold. Honestly, it's like medieval Europe was running out of adjectives. Anyway, Blanche marries Charles. She's crowned queen, which sounds glamorous, but her reign lasts exactly 3 months before Charles conveniently dies. Some historians have debated whether she was pregnant with his child or not, but either way, she never ruled as regent. Instead, she was quietly pushed off to a convent. That's right, 18 years old, 3 months as queen, and boom, welcome to nun life. A downgrade from queen to abbess feels like switching from a palace suite to the world's strictest Airbnb, and Blanche wasn't unique. This was a running theme. Queens whose job description was essentially, provide an heir, look nice at banquets, and please don't get in the way. The moment their husband died without them producing a male heir, they were shuffled into monasteries like spare furniture. It's almost comical in how predictable it was. Now let's drift over to England, where the tradition of sidelined queens was alive and well. One of my personal favorites in the Forgotten Queens category is Anne of Cleves, Henry VIII's fourth wife. And if you've heard anything about Henry VIII, you know he was basically running medieval England like a very violent version of The Bachelor. Roses were replaced with annulments, and instead of being sent home, the women often lost their heads, literally. But Anne of Cleves, she was the lucky one. Henry married her sight unseen, based on a portrait by Hans Holbein. Spoiler, Henry thought she looked prettier in paint. When Anne arrived in England, Henry took one look at her and apparently said she looked like a Flanders mare, which is both insulting and oddly specific. Like, thank you, Henry, for equating your new wife with a Belgian draft horse, very regal. Henry, being Henry, immediately wanted out. The marriage lasted about 6 months before being annulled, and Anne, she didn't fight it. She agreed to step aside, kept her head firmly attached to her body, and was given a generous settlement, including several estates and the honorary title of the king's beloved sister. Which, yes, is extremely weird, but Anne leaned into it. She ended up living comfortably in England, playing cards, visiting court, and outliving all of Henry's other wives. Anne's life is a prime example of how being a forgotten queen could actually be the best possible outcome. She went from almost being executed to chilling in the countryside with her own property portfolio. And if Henry wanted to whine about annulments, Anne was probably too busy sipping wine on her estate patio to care. Let's float back across the channel to the Spanish Habsburgs, the reigning champions of inbreeding and general dynastic dysfunction. One woman who fits our theme here is Elizabeth of Valois, who married Philip II of Spain in 1559. She was only 14 years old when she got married. And Philip, he was 32, which means their relationship dynamic was basically, "Hi Dad, oh wait husband." Now Philip wasn't exactly known for being fun. This is the same guy who sent the Spanish Armada against England and bankrupted his empire multiple times. He was also obsessed with religion in a way that made him about as lively as a wet blanket. Elizabeth, meanwhile, was this lively French teenager who liked dancing and fashion. Their marriage was, predictably, awkward. She never actually ruled alongside him. She wasn't allowed into council meetings. She didn't influence politics, and when she died young, at only 23, Philip just moved on. She's remembered mostly as a footnote in his long, dreary biography. The forgotten queen, overshadowed by her husband's obsession with power and eventually with marrying her younger sister. Yes, you heard that right. When Elizabeth died, Philip married her 14-year-old sister, because apparently recycling wives was a totally acceptable Habsburg tradition. Now, if you're noticing a theme here, it's that forgotten queens were usually very young women thrown into marriages with much older men, stripped of agency, and then sidelined when they didn't produce a conveniently healthy son. Their portraits might hang in museums, but their voices are practically missing from the records, which is kind of eerie when you think about it. But of course, some of them found ways to carve out little lives for themselves, even in obscurity. Like Anne of Cleves, or Blanche, who actually became an influential abbess later on, or others who just lived quietly in the shadow of husbands who got all the credit. And since we're in this vibe now, let's slowly float toward another queen who technically had the crown but no real power. Isabella of Angoulême, the second wife of King John of England, aka Bad King John. You know, the guy who lost half of England's lands in France, ticked off the barons and ended up signing the Magna Carta, which he definitely didn't want to do. Isabella was about 12 years old when John married her, which, yes, was appallingly normal back then. She became queen consort, but John wasn't exactly interested in giving her influence. He was too busy being one of the least competent kings England ever had. Isabella lived in the background, popping out children while John alienated his nobles. After John's death, Isabella technically became Dowager Queen, but instead of ruling, she remarried secretly to a much younger French nobleman, which caused a minor scandal, mostly because queens weren't supposed to remarry without permission. But honestly, good for her. After years of being forgotten, she at least got to make one bold move in her life, and she seemed genuinely happier in her secondess marriage than she ever was as Queen of England. So from convent nuns to annulled wives to overlooked teenagers, the theme of forgotten queens shows us just how disposable women could be in the medieval and early modern royal machine. Some found small freedoms in the margins, others faded into obscurity, and a rare few, like Anne of Cleves, managed to spin a disastrous marriage into a surprisingly cozy retirement. And that is just the beginning. We've only brushed past a handful of queens who slipped through the cracks of history's spotlight. But don't worry, we'll keep wandering through palaces, nunneries, and scandalous second marriages as we go. More lives of forgotten queens who never ruled all right. So we left off with Isabella of Angoulême, sneaking off into her second marriage, probably having the time of her life, while England collectively rolled its eyes. Let's stay in this drowsy lane of royal misfits and forgotten consorts, because there are plenty more where she came from. And really, if there's one king who provided more forgotten queens than anyone else, it's Henry VIII. We already whispered about Anne of Cleves, the one who technically won his marital Hunger Games by surviving him. But of course we can't forget about Catherine Howard. Henry's fifth wife, Catherine, was young, as in very young, somewhere between 16 and 18 when she married the king, who was at that point an overweight middle-aged man with a leg ulcer, so gross that even contemporary accounts describe it in detail. So imagine being a teenager, suddenly queen, and your husband is, let's say, not in peak condition. She had no political power whatsoever. None. She was basically paraded around court like Henry's midlife crisis accessory. And because she was young, reckless, and surrounded by people who saw her as a pawn, she got caught up in scandals involving old flames and possibly a lover or two. And Henry, being Henry, didn't take betrayal lightly. You probably know where this is going. Catherine lost her head after only about a year and a half as queen, forgotten almost instantly, overshadowed by Henry's bigger political drama and his next wife. If Anne of Cleves was the queen who lived comfortably forgotten, Catherine was the queen who was inconveniently forgotten. Now, before this gets too heavy, let's shift our focus. We don't want things too exciting. This is bedtime history after all. Let's wander softly over to Spain again to visit a queen who lived long but stayed, firmly sidelined, Juana of Austria, sometimes called Juana the Mad, or Juana la Loca. And yes, you're probably thinking, wait, wasn't Juana la Loca a queen regnant? Didn't she technically rule? Well, sort of. But the reality is she never actually wielded power. Everyone around her decided she was too unstable to govern, which may or may not have been true. A lot of her supposed madness looked suspiciously like grief, depression, and the frustration of being locked away for decades by her own family. Juana married Philip the Handsome of Burgundy, whose spoiler was not particularly handsome, unless you consider the Habsburg jaw a desirable feature. He died young and Juana was devastated. The official line was that she went insane from grief. She carried his coffin around for months, refused to part with his body, and generally behaved in ways that made people uncomfortable. But was she truly mad? Or just a young widow trapped in a dynastic nightmare? Either way, her father, Ferdinand, and later her son, Charles V, made sure she never had any real power. She spent almost 50 years confined in a convent, technically Queen of Castile, but in practice, just a forgotten figure locked away in the shadows of stronger men. If you want a tragic queen who never ruled, Juana's your woman. Her story is haunting because she lived so long and yet barely left a mark on politics. Instead, her legacy is mostly sad portraits and whispered rumors about her sanity, which, honestly, sounds like a very on-brand way to be a forgotten queen. Let's take a gentle detour north to Scandinavia, where we meet Queen Christina of Denmark, not to be confused with the more famous Christina of Sweden, who at least made waves by abdicating and moving to Rome to live her best eccentric life. No, Christina of Denmark is mostly remembered for not marrying Henry VIII. Here's how it went. After Henry executed Catherine Howard, he went wife shopping again, and his ambassadors suggested Christina, who was in her teens and recently widowed. When asked about the possibility of marrying Henry, Christina allegedly said, "If I had 2 heads, one should be at the King of England's disposal." Which is, wow, possibly the sassiest medieval rejection letter ever. Naturally, she didn't marry him. Instead, she ended up marrying the Duke of Lorraine, living a fairly quiet life and not ruling much of anything. She pops up in portraits, looking regal, but she was always on the sidelines of bigger political games, another queen-type figure who slid right back into obscurity. Now, since we're floating, let's glide over to France again, because if there's one dynasty that had a whole roster of sidelined queens, it's the French Valois and Bourbons. One striking example is Marie Leschinska, who became Queen of France in the early 18th century by marrying Louis XIV. Marie wasn't a glamorous political match. She was the daughter of a deposed Polish king, basically royalty on clearance. When Louis needed a bride, she was available, respectable, and harmless. And that's exactly how she lived out her life as queen. Harmless. She had lots of children, 10 in total, but never influenced policy. Louis XV grew bored of her fairly quickly, filled Versailles with mistresses, and left Marie to retreat into religious devotion. She was queen for decades, but if you flip through the history of France, her name barely registers, forgotten in plain sight, overshadowed by the king's endless parade of affairs. Marie is a perfect example of how being a forgotten queen wasn't always tragic. It could also just be boring. She lived in Versailles, attended ceremonies, prayed a lot, and quietly died, leaving no one particularly inspired or devastated. She was like a decorative statue in the palace gardens, always there, but rarely noticed. Let's drift back a little further in time, to the Holy Roman Empire, where we find Empress Isabella of Portugal, wife of Charles V. Now you might think, Empress, that sounds powerful. But the thing is, Charles V spent most of his life traveling around fighting wars and micromanaging his vast empire. Isabella was left behind to govern Spain in his absence, but she was never remembered for it. When she died young, Charles was devastated, but politically she faded instantly. Her husband and her children became the focus, while she was just another woman buried under Habsburg grandeur. Forgotten despite technically holding one of the grandest titles in Europe. And maybe that's the pattern we're seeing. Titles didn't always mean influence. Queens were crowned, anointed, and dressed in jewels, but when it came to actual power, they were often invisible. Before we start nodding off entirely, let's wrap this section with one more. Berengaria of Navarre, wife of Richard the Lionheart. She's a fascinating case because she technically was Queen Consort of England, and yet she never even set foot in England during her marriage. Not once. Richard married her while he was on the way to the Crusades. Then he basically abandoned her to go fight in the Holy Land, got captured on his way home, and when he finally returned, he spent most of his time fighting wars in France. Berengaria stayed abroad the entire time. So yes, England had a queen, who literally never visited. After Richard's death, she lived quietly in France, managing estates and being politely ignored by English history. Forgotten to the point that many people today don't even realize Richard the Lionheart had a wife. So from Catherine Howard's short-lived teenage marriage to Juana la Loca's decades of confinement, from Christina of Denmark's snappy one-liner to Berengaria's long-distance queenship, the pattern is clear. Being queen didn't guarantee fame, influence, or even recognition. It often just meant playing the part until history stopped caring. And on that sleepy note, let's drift onward. Because we still have plenty more forgotten queens waiting in the wings. Even more forgotten queens who never ruled. So where were we? Ah yes, poor Berengaria of Navarre, the Queen of England who never even stepped foot in England, which really sets the bar low for job commitment. But hey, at least she didn't get beheaded. So maybe that counts as a win in the medieval queen career track. Let's keep moving gently forward in time and sideways across Europe, because there are plenty of other royal women who wore the title of Queen, but never quite got to be remembered for it. And since we left off with Richard the Lionheart's absentee wife, let's stick with Plantagenet drama for a moment. Enter Margaret of Anjou, Queen Consort to Henry VI of England. Now technically, Margaret wasn't completely forgotten. She did get involved in politics during the Wars of the Roses, and historians certainly know her name. But the funny thing is, she was remembered more for being aggressive and unpopular than for her actual queenship, which is almost worse than being forgotten. Her husband, Henry VI, was famously not great at being king. He had long bouts of mental instability, and when he wasn't catatonic, he was usually indecisive, which left Margaret trying to pick up the slack. But instead of being admired for it, she was criticized endlessly. English nobles didn't want a French-born queen pulling strings. They called her controlling, ambitious, even unnatural, for acting like she had authority. So Margaret spent her life trying to keep her husband on the throne, fighting for her son's inheritance, and generally being the kind of woman people gossiped about but didn't respect. And when her side eventually lost, she was dragged off into exile, penniless and largely ignored. In the big English history books, Henry VI is remembered as the weak king, Edward IV as the strong replacement, and Margaret, just a footnote. A scapegoat for everything people didn't like about women in politics. It's ironic. She worked harder than most queens ever did, but her legacy is still closer to forgettable than formidable. Now, speaking of queens who fought uphill battles, let's shift softly to Catherine Parr, Henry VIII's sixth and final wife. You'd think being the last one would make her memorable. She literally survived Henry, which was an achievement in itself. But compared to Anne Boleyn's scandal, or Catherine Howard's tragedy, Catherine Parr's story gets skipped over a lot. Catherine was older than Henry's other wives. She'd already been married twice before, both times to older men who died. So when Henry picked her as wife number 6, she was experienced, practical, and most importantly, not interested in rebelling against him. She nursed him in his final years, read theology books with him, and mostly kept her head down. She did have a brief scare when Henry suspected her of being too Protestant in her views. There was even a warrant for her arrest at one point. But she managed to talk her way out of it by pretending she was just a humble woman trying to learn from her husband's wisdom. A bit of strategic flattery and boom, the charges disappeared. Catherine Parr outlived Henry, remarried for love, and even published her own book. But in the grand scheme of things, she's barely remembered. Ask the average person to list Henry's wives, and they'll stumble after Anne Boleyn and maybe Anne of Cleves. Catherine Parr's legacy, being the last one. Not a bad role, but definitely a forgotten queen compared to the drama queens before her. From there, let's float to a different flavor of forgotten queen, Isabella of Hainaut, wife of Philip II of France in the 12th century. Isabella married young. She was about 10 when she got engaged and 12 when she married, which again, medieval Europe, never not weird. Her marriage to Philip wasn't exactly smooth. When she didn't produce a son right away, Philip threatened to divorce her, because of course in the medieval logic handbook, infertility was always the woman's fault. Isabella eventually did give birth to a son, Louis, but she died young at just 19. Philip, who would go on to be one of France's most important medieval kings, barely paused. Isabella's entire queenship was reduced to being a womb that didn't quite work fast enough. Her memory faded so quickly that even contemporary chroniclers only mentioned her in passing. She's buried in Notre Dame, But unless you're really into French royal genealogy, you'd never know her name. And that's a common thread here. Being forgotten often came down to whether or not you produced a male heir. Success meant you got remembered as mother of the next king. Failure meant your name just slipped off the page. Now let's glide eastward to the glittering but exhausting world of the Austrian Habsburgs. And yes, brace yourself. We're going to talk about Empress Elizabeth of Austria, better known as Sisi. Now you might protest, wait, she's famous. And yes, in the 19th century she became a romanticized figure, even the subject of movies. But here's the thing. During her actual life, Elizabeth was constantly sidelined, ignored, and treated as ornamental, which basically made her a forgotten queen in her own time. She married Emperor Franz Joseph at 16. She was beautiful, tall, with waist-length hair that took 3 hours a day to style. Everyone adored her image. But behind the glamour, she was miserable. The Austrian court was rigid. Her mother-in-law was overbearing, and Elizabeth had no political influence. She struggled with depression, eating disorders, and the suffocating expectations of being an empress. While Franz Joseph ran the empire, Elizabeth wandered around Europe, writing melancholy poetry and avoiding her duties. By the time she died tragically, stabbed by an anarchist in Geneva, she had spent decades as a ghost-like figure, technically the empress, but emotionally absent. Famous today, yes, but in her own century, she was more forgotten than revered. And speaking of emperors' wives who were miserable, let's gently wander back in time to the Byzantine Empire. Because the Byzantines had their own collection of queens consort who barely got noticed. One striking example is Maria of Antioch, who married Emperor Manuel I Komnenos in the 12th century. Maria came from the Crusader states, so her marriage was a political alliance. When Manuel died, she technically acted as regent for their young son. But almost immediately the court ignored her, rivals undermined her, and she was eventually sidelined into obscurity. In some accounts, she was even accused of being too Latin for the Byzantine court, too Western to be trusted. Her story is one of those where you read 3 sentences in a history book, and then she vanishes completely. Forgotten even in the empire she tried to govern. Now let's take one more gentle stop for this section with a queen who may be one of the most unfairly forgotten of all. Anne of Bohemia, wife of Richard II of England. Anne married Richard when she was just 16. She was known for being kind, charitable, and surprisingly popular with ordinary people. But she had no political power, and her marriage to Richard produced no children, which, as we've noticed, was basically a death sentence for a queen's legacy. When Anne died at 28, Richard was devastated. He demolished the palace where she died out of grief. For a moment she was remembered as good Queen Anne, but with no heirs and no political influence, she quickly faded from memory. Most people today couldn't tell you her name. Forgotten, despite being one of the rare queens who was actually liked. So in this quiet drift through more sidelined women, Margaret of Anjou's unappreciated struggles, Catherine Parr's overlooked survival, Isabella of Hainault's teenage tragedy, Empress Elizabeth's melancholy, Maria of Antioch's dismissal, and Anne of Bohemia's fading memory, we see the same theme repeat. Queens who technically had crowns, but no real control over their own destinies. Their husbands went down in history as kings, tyrants, or reformers. The queens, their portraits gather dust in palaces, their tombs sit unnoticed in cathedrals, and their names fall off the page. And as we keep gliding, you'll see there are still plenty more of these forgotten queens waiting in the margins, whispering from the shadows of history. Forgotten queens in palaces, courts, and shadows. So, Last time we left off with Anne of Bohemia. Sweet, kind, beloved Anne, whose only mistake in the history books was not producing an heir, which, as we've seen, is basically the historical equivalent of accidentally hitting delete on your own legacy. Now let's gently drift from medieval and Renaissance Europe into the glittering but equally unforgiving world of the Bourbons and Romanovs. Because when it comes to being forgotten, these dynasties turned it into something of an art form. Let's begin in France with the Bourbon court, famous for powdered wigs, endless etiquette, and queens who looked important, but often weren't. Take Maria Theresa of Spain, wife of Louis XIV, the Sun King. Maria Theresa was technically Queen of France for more than 20 years. That sounds impressive, but in reality, she was completely overshadowed by her husband's mistresses. Louis XIV adored women, just not usually his wife. Madame de Montespan and later Madame de Maintenon ran the show, while Maria Theresa stayed in the background. One courtier described her as a good queen but insignificant, which is the kind of compliment that belongs embroidered on a very depressing pillow. She bore Louis 6 children, most of whom died young, and she lived quietly in Versailles, where she was often left out of court entertainments. When she died, Louis is said to have remarked, "This is the first trouble she has ever given me." Romantic, right? Forgotten in life, forgotten in death, and this pattern repeated with her successors. Even the infamous Marie Antoinette had sisters who became equally forgotten queens. Take Maria Carolina of Austria, who married Ferdinand IV of Naples. She was politically active, yes, but her husband was, let's be polite and call him, not a genius. She ended up ruling through him, but her legacy is minimal compared to her glamorous sister. Then there's Maria Amalia, married to the Duke of Parma, who faded so completely from the record that even historians struggle to say much about her beyond, yes, she existed. Meanwhile, Marie Antoinette, famous for being fashionable, frivolous, and very publicly executed, hogged all the limelight. Her sisters were just as royal, just as crowned, but completely sidelined by history's obsession with the one who got the guillotine. Now, let's drift east to Russia, where the Romanovs produced their own share of forgotten wives. One particularly striking case is Maria of Hessen, first wife of Tsar Alexander II. She technically became Empress of Russia, but the marriage was cold, formal, and largely miserable. Maria was deeply religious, shy, and unwell for most of her life. Alexander, meanwhile, was busy reforming Russia and carrying on an affair with a much younger mistress, whom he eventually married after Maria's death. Maria spent most of her time ill, isolated, and ignored. She was technically the empress of all the Russias, but you'd be forgiven for not noticing. Her husband is remembered as the Tsar Liberator for emancipating the serfs. She is remembered, if at all, as the sickly wife he tolerated. Her daughter-in-law, Empress Maria Feodorovna, overshadowed her completely. So Maria Alexandrovna's queenship was essentially just existing in palaces until she faded away, a forgotten empress in one of history's most flamboyant courts. But if we're talking Russian forgotten queens, we can't ignore the sheer conveyor belt of Tsars' wives, who barely lasted long enough to be remembered. The Romanov men had a habit of discarding wives the second they became inconvenient, which of course echoes Henry VIII. Apparently, royal men across Europe shared a universal handbook called How to Be Terrible at Marriage. Speaking of discarded wives, let's gently turn back to England for a moment, because we can't resist one more of Henry VIII's sidelined women, Catherine of Aragon. Yes, she's not exactly forgotten, Everyone knows her as Henry's first wife. But what people forget is that she was actually a competent, intelligent queen who held the throne for 2 decades, and yet her legacy gets boiled down to the one Henry divorced because she didn't have a son. She actually served as regent while Henry was at war, commanded troops against the Scots, and won. But none of that mattered, because Henry moved on to Anne Boleyn. Catherine's long accomplished queenship is remembered only as the setup to Henry's marital drama, forgotten, even in plain sight. Now, let's leave the Tudors behind before they dominate the entire story. We're drifting over to the Holy Roman Empire again to meet another sidelined woman, Claudia Felicitas of Austria, wife of Leopold I. She was young, beautiful, and married off for the usual dynastic reasons. She died at 22, childless. Her husband remarried almost immediately, and her brief stint as empress slipped out of memory. Her portraits still exist, big skirts, elaborate hair, but her name is usually buried in footnotes, forgotten not because she did something wrong, but because she simply didn't live long enough to matter. This brings up an important theme. So many forgotten queens were victims of early deaths. Disease, childbirth, stress. It was all stacked against them. Queens were supposed to provide heirs. If they died before doing so, history just moved on without them. Their crowns might as well have been borrowed jewelry. And yet, sometimes, even queens who did produce heirs got forgotten anyway. Take Louise of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, wife of Frederick William III of Prussia. She was wildly popular in her own time, adored for her beauty and kindness, but her actual political influence was minimal. When Napoleon defeated Prussia, she begged him for mercy, but it didn't matter. She became a symbol after her death, but today, most people couldn't tell you her name. Another example of fame that evaporated into faint memory. Let's slide back into France one more time, because Versailles was practically a factory for forgotten queens. After Maria Theresa of Spain came Marie Leschinska, whom we touched on earlier. She was queen for 43 years, one of the longest reigns in French history, and yet almost nobody remembers her. Why? Because she was quiet, dutiful, and eclipsed by Louis XV's mistresses. Madame de Pompadour and Madame du Barry stole the stage. Marie Leschinska lived in the same palace, attended the same court, wore the same diamonds, but in the end she was invisible. She's one of those queens who technically shaped dynastic history. She gave birth to the Dauphin, after all, but her actual personhood, lost, forgotten. And this is where it gets ironic. The queens who behaved, stayed quiet, and fulfilled. Their roles got forgotten. The queens who misbehaved, Anne Boleyn, Marie Antoinette, got remembered forever. So in a way, the only route to immortality for a queen was either scandal or execution. Otherwise, you faded away like wallpaper. Let's finish this part with one of my personal favorites, Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, wife of King George III of Britain. Yes, she was queen for over 50 years. Yes, she had 15 children. But George III's reign is remembered for 2 things: losing the American colonies and going mad. Charlotte, meanwhile, spent her life quietly supporting him, running the household, and caring for their enormous brood of children. She was cultured, musical and well-educated, but in the grand sweep of history, she's almost invisible. Even in pop culture, she's been rediscovered only recently, and usually in fictionalized, romanticized portrayals. The real Charlotte, another queen who lived in the palace, bore the heirs, and was quietly forgotten. So, here we are again, Maria Theresa of Spain, forgotten behind mistresses. Maria Amalia of Austria, forgotten behind her famous sister. Maria Alexandrovna, forgotten behind her husband's mistress. Claudia Felicitas, forgotten by an early death. Maria Leszczyńska, forgotten by boredom. And Queen Charlotte, forgotten behind her husband's mental decline. Different countries, different centuries, but always the same pattern. These women had crowns, titles, jewels, and portraits. But history shrugged and moved on, and in the gentle monotone of hindsight, their lives blend together into one long story of women who technically were queens, but never ruled. Forgotten queens beyond Europe so far. We've been wandering through France, England, Spain, and Russia. Basically the greatest hits of European dynastic dysfunction. But forgotten queens weren't exclusive to Europe. The same quiet pattern existed everywhere. Women crowned, adored briefly, then sidelined, erased, or overshadowed. Tonight, let's float eastward, because Asia and the Islamic world produced their own share of women who technically had the title, but not the legacy. Let's start with the Ottoman Empire, where the word queen wasn't even used. Instead, the women at the top of the hierarchy were the valide sultans, mothers of reigning sultans, or the chief consorts. And while some of them, like Roxelana, Hürrem Sultan, are remembered for their power, many others simply faded away. Take Mahidevran, Sultan, the first chief consort of Suleiman the Magnificent. At the start she was important. She gave Suleiman his first son, Mustafa, and looked like she might be the queenly partner of his reign. But then along came Roxelana, who basically outmaneuvered everyone at court. Mahidevran was pushed aside, stripped of her influence, and eventually exiled after her son was executed. She lived out her days in relative obscurity, technically once the leading consort of one of the greatest emperors in history. But today, most people couldn't pick her name out of a lineup, forgotten by design, overshadowed by her rival. The Ottoman harem was full of women like Mahidevran, briefly elevated then discarded the moment politics turned against them. Crowns, silks, and jewels didn't guarantee remembrance. You could be the mother of a prince one day and a footnote the next. Let's glide softly over to Mughal India, where the emperors built literal world wonders for their wives. You know the Taj Mahal, of course, built by Shah Jahan for Mumtaz. Mahal. And because of that, Mumtaz is remembered, almost mythologized. But what about all the other Mughal queens? Take Nur Jahan, for example. She was married to Emperor Jahangir and wielded real influence, issuing imperial orders, minting coins in her name. Yet today, outside of India, she's barely remembered. Ask most people to name a Mughal empress, and they'll jump straight to Mumtaz Mahal because of the Taj. Nur Jahan, despite being one of the most politically powerful women of her time, is barely a whisper in the background. Forgotten not because she was powerless, but because her power didn't come with a giant marble monument. Then there were queens like Hamida Banu Begum, mother of Emperor Akbar. She was there at the foundation of one of India's greatest empires. But history tends to file her under supporting caste. Without Akbar, her name is a ghost. Another forgotten queen who technically shaped history, but is overshadowed by men's legacies. Now, since we're on the theme of being overshadowed, let's drift back into Europe for a moment to look at the Habsburg brides who were shipped across borders like diplomatic packages. Few were as forgotten as Maria Anna of Spain, who married her cousin Ferdinand III, Holy Roman Emperor. Maria Anna had the bad luck of being a Habsburg in the middle of the 30 Years' War, which meant Her entire queenship was basically overshadowed by endless conflict. She bore children, she prayed, she kept the court running while armies trampled across Europe. But when historians talk about the war, they talk about generals, treaties, and emperors. Maria Anna, Empress of the Holy Roman Empire? Just another. Portrait hanging in Vienna, largely ignored. And then there's Elizabeth of Bohemia, nicknamed the Winter Queen. She was married to Frederick V of the Palatinate, who accepted the crown of Bohemia in 1619. The catch? They only held the throne for a single winter before being kicked out, which means Elizabeth was technically a queen for, a few months. She spent the rest of her life in exile, living in poverty, raising a brood of children who would scatter across Europe. Her brief queenship was a running joke at the time, and it still is. The Winter Queen, forgotten except by specialists who enjoy pointing out just how short her reign was. Imagine dedicating your life to the title of Queen, and history only remembers you as a seasonal meme. Now let's drift north for a while, into the chilly courts of Scandinavia. Queens here also had a habit of vanishing from memory. Take Louise of the Netherlands, who married Charles XV of Sweden in the 19th century. She was queen for almost 15 years, but because she was shy, sickly, and had a difficult marriage, she faded into the background. Her husband was flamboyant and unfaithful. Her successors were more dramatic, and Louise, quietly forgotten. Or consider Hedwig Eleonora of Holstein-Gottorp, who was queen consort of Sweden in the 17th century. She was widowed young, served as regent multiple times, and technically held one of the most powerful positions a woman could have. Yet her legacy was buried under the exploits of Swedish warrior kings like Charles V. She held the kingdom together, but history prefers battles to regencies. Forgotten queen, hidden behind the war stories. While we're wandering Scandinavia, we can't skip over Anne of Denmark, wife of James III of England. Now, technically she's remembered a little, mainly because she patronized the arts and brought a bit of flair to court life. But her husband's reign is remembered for the King James Bible, Shakespeare's later plays, and the beginnings of English colonization. Anne, mostly remembered as, oh right, James had a wife. She was Queen of England, Scotland, and Ireland for more than 2 decades, and yet her legacy is basically reduced to fancy masks and court drama. Forgotten, even while wearing 3 crowns. Let's slow down and take one last detour to Japan, because the Japanese imperial household also produced women who technically were empresses, but slipped into obscurity. One example is Empress Teimei, wife of Emperor Taisho in the early 20th century. Taisho himself was plagued with ill health and struggled with his role. Teimei, by contrast, was intelligent and politically aware. She quietly influenced decisions, advocated for peace, and guided her son, the future Emperor Showa Hirohito. But because Japan's imperial family operated under strict traditions of invisibility, her contributions were hidden. In official records, she's almost absent, a ghost behind the throne, forgotten despite being central to the stability of the dynasty. And that's really the global pattern, isn't it? From Mahidevran Sultan being eclipsed by Roxolana, to Nur Jahan being outshined by the Taj Mahal, to Elizabeth of Bohemia being reduced to a punchline, to Anne of Denmark being remembered only as an accessory to James the Fair. The forgotten queens were everywhere. Crowns sparkled, ceremonies were performed, titles were bestowed. But when the ink dried on the history books, the queens who didn't scandalize, didn't rebel, or didn't produce famous heirs simply dissolved into the background. Their portraits stare at us from museums, but their voices are silent, and as we keep drifting, we'll see there are still even more. Queens who were sidelined in modern times, queens who lived long but were outshined by their husbands' politics, queens who technically reigned but left no ripples. The forgotten queens never really disappear. They just hover in the margins, waiting to be noticed again. The modern ghost queens. By the time we reach the 19th and 20th centuries, you might think queens would have a better shot at being remembered. After all, technology was catching up. Portraits were replaced with photographs, diaries with newspapers, whispers with radio broadcasts. Surely in the age of mass media, queens couldn't just vanish into obscurity anymore, right? Well, wrong. Turns out you can wear a crown in front of cameras, stand beside emperors, and even live through world wars and still have history pat you on the shoulder and say, thanks, but no thanks. These women weren't forgotten in their own lifetimes, but once their husbands died or regimes changed, their names faded. Let's start with Queen Elizabeth of Belgium. She became Queen Consort in 1909, right before the world went off a cliff into World War I. Her husband, King Albert I, became famous as the Night King for leading Belgian troops into battle. He was heroic, tragic, romantic, the full package. Elizabeth, meanwhile, worked tirelessly as a nurse during the war, visited hospitals and tried to boost morale. But who got the credit in the long run? Albert. And to make matters worse, after Albert's sudden death in a mountaineering accident, Elizabeth lived for decades as a dowager queen. She was still active, still patronizing the arts, still shaping cultural life. Yet today, when people say Queen Elizabeth, they usually mean the British one. This Elizabeth is just a ghost, hidden behind a louder royal story. Next, let's drift down into Italy, where the monarchy was always a little shaky, and the queens often carried the weight of that instability. Consider Eleanor of Montenegro, who became Queen of Italy by marrying King Victor Emmanuel III. Eleanor was a steady, compassionate figure. She worked for charity, trained as a nurse, and tried to be a calming influence during a turbulent reign. But Victor Emmanuel was a small man with a very large historical problem. He's the king who basically enabled Mussolini and fascism. When Mussolini was rising to power, Victor Emmanuel could have acted. He didn't. He just let it happen. So, when Italians think of their monarchy now, they remember Victor Emmanuel's failure. Elena, despite her decades of queenship, her wartime work, and her charity, mostly forgotten, buried under her husband's mistakes. Speaking of being buried, let's talk about Queen Maria of Romania, who, unlike many others on this list, is remembered a little because she was glamorous and outspoken. But even she got eclipsed by the chaos of her family. Maria was married to King Ferdinand I, and she basically kept Romania on the Allied side during World War I through sheer force of personality. After the war, she was seen as this almost legendary beauty diplomat. But then came her children. Oh, her children. They were, to put it gently, a spectacular mess. The most famous was Carol II, who reigned badly, abdicated, and left the throne to his son. And his own scandals were so distracting that Maria's legacy faded into the background. She was once one of the most photographed royals in Europe. Now, she's a trivia question in Romanian history. Forgotten not because she was weak, but because her family was too dysfunctional to leave her memory intact. Now let's drift to Spain, where the monarchy was always a roller coaster of exiles and restorations. Take Queen Ina of Spain, formerly Victoria Eugenie of Battenberg. She was a granddaughter of Queen Victoria of Britain, shipped off to Spain to marry King Alfonso III. The marriage was rocky from day one. At their wedding in Madrid, an anarchist threw a bomb at the royal carriage. Welcome to queenship, Ina. It didn't get better. Alfonso was unfaithful. Their children were plagued by genetic illness, thanks to haemophilia, which Ina unknowingly carried, and Spain itself was collapsing politically. When Alfonso was forced into exile in 1931, Ina followed. She lived in exile for decades, mostly forgotten, while Spain itself descended into civil war and dictatorship. Imagine being a queen of Spain, married into a dynasty that traced itself back centuries, and ending up spending half your life in Switzerland with barely anyone remembering your name. That was Ina's fate. A queen, technically, but erased by exile. Let's soften our drift now and pause in Greece, a monarchy that was notoriously unlucky. One of its most overlooked queens was Amalia of Oldenburg, the first queen consort of modern Greece in the 19th century. She was German, brought in to marry King Otto, and quickly became a symbol of foreign influence. Greeks didn't particularly like her. She tried to bring modern reforms, but she wasn't exactly subtle about being Bavarian, and resentment grew. When Otto was deposed in 1862, Amalia left Greece forever, and while she lived until 1875, she spent her later years in exile, remembered mostly for her Amalia dress, a national costume she popularized, rather than her queenship. She could have been remembered as a founder figure of modern Greek royalty. Instead, she's a footnote with a fashion legacy. Now, I can't resist one more glance at the Russian stage, even though we already passed through earlier. After Catherine, the queens and empresses who followed tended to be quieter, or at least more constrained. Take Empress Alexandra Feodorovna, wife of Nicholas II, the last Tsar of Russia. Technically, Alexandra isn't forgotten. She's infamous, mainly for her disastrous influence over Nicholas, her reliance on Rasputin, and her role in undermining the monarchy's credibility. But here's the irony. Her actual personal story, her loneliness, her struggles with poor, health, her devotion to her sickly son, is often overshadowed by caricature. People remember the hysterical Tsarina with Rasputin, not Alexandra the human. She's remembered, but not fairly. A ghost of a queen, more symbol than person. And speaking of ghost queens, let's glide into the British monarchy one more time, because even there, with its endless fascination, some queens get quietly shelved. Everyone remembers Queen Victoria, Queen Elizabeth II, and of course, Elizabeth I. But how many remember Queen Adelaide? She was consort to William IV in the early 19th century. Adelaide was respected, pious, gentle. She supported charities, avoided scandal, and tried to be a good influence. But William's reign was short, overshadowed by the coming of Victoria. Adelaide ended up being remembered less as a queen and more as the namesake of Adelaide, Australia. That's right, the city outlived her legacy. And then there's Queen Mary of Teck, consort to George V and grandmother of Elizabeth II. Mary was queen during World War I, a stabilizing figure who kept the monarchy looking dignified. She lived long into the 1950s, witnessing both her sons reign as kings. And yet she doesn't really stick in popular memory. She's the woman in stiff portraits, wearing massive jewels, with an expression somewhere between stern and sleepy. She held the crown for decades, but people remember George V for his mustache and his role in World War I more than they remember Mary. It's funny, isn't it? Even in modern times, with photographs and newspapers, queens could still just evaporate into the background. The louder men, the wars, the scandals, they swallowed the women whole. So whether it was Queen Elizabeth of Belgium tending to wounded soldiers, or Queen Ina of Spain dodging bombs and exile, or Queen Mary sitting through endless state dinners, the result was the same. Forgotten queens. Women who technically shaped dynasties, endured wars, raised heirs, or held countries together, but who today are little more than faint outlines in history. And as we drift toward the end of this sleepy history, we're left with that same quiet thought. The queens who never ruled, never rebelled, and never grabbed the pen of history for themselves were the ones who faded the fastest. Their crowns glittered in the moment. Their portraits survive. But their stories, forgotten until someone late at night decides to whisper them back to life. Closing the curtain on forgotten queens, so here we are. We've wandered through palaces, drafty castles, and chilly exiles. We've met queens who were clever, kind, ambitious, or just very unlucky. And through it all, one thing kept happening. They wore the crown, they played their part, and then history shrugged and looked the other way. The queens we've talked about tonight were not failures. They didn't topple kingdoms single-handedly. They didn't burn empires to the ground. They simply existed in the shadows of men, dynasties, and louder events. And for that, they were forgotten. It's strange when you think about it. Whole armies marched for these women. Wars were fought in their names, treaties sealed with their signatures, children born from their bodies, and yet they barely exist in memory. You can almost hear them sighing through the cracks of old portraits. Yes, I was here, I lived this life, but you moved on? Let's drift back over the trail we followed tonight. We started with the medieval queens. Poor Agnes of France, shipped off at 12 to marry a Byzantine emperor, left widowed and quietly erased. Then Isabella of France, remembered mostly as the she-wolf, when in reality her story was far sadder, more complicated, more human. We met queens who lost children, who endured cruel husbands, who were pawns in dynastic chess games they never agreed to play. Then we drifted into the early modern queens, Catherine of Aragon, patient and pious, outshone by Anne Boleyn's drama. Poor Anne of Cleves, dismissed as ugly by Henry VIII, when she actually outlived them all. And Catherine Parr, who managed to survive Henry, only to die in childbirth anyway, her survival instinct not enough to save her. We floated further, into the Renaissance and Baroque eras, where queens were draped in lace and jewels, but often hollowed out inside. Maria Anna of Spain, so pious she practically turned invisible. Elizabeth Christine of Brunswick, married to Frederick the Great, who openly despised her. Or poor Anna of Austria, the foreign queen who was too Catholic for England, and too much of a scapegoat to be remembered fairly. And then the 18th century, where inbreeding reached its creative peak. Maria Anna of Austria married off to Portugal, so fragile from generations of family overlap that she barely held her position together. Amélie of Orléans, consort of Portugal, who ruled for only 2 years before being forgotten in exile. Queens who had titles, crowns, jewels, but no lasting stories. From there, we wandered into the 19th century and beyond. Caroline of Brunswick, rejected by her husband George IV, and mocked endlessly by the British press. Alexandra of Denmark, adored in life but overshadowed by her mother-in-law, Queen Victoria. Elizabeth of Belgium, tending to wounded soldiers in World War I, her efforts buried under her husband's reputation. Elena of Montenegro, watching her husband Victor Emmanuel blunder Italy into fascism and carrying the blame silently. And finally, the 20th century ghosts. Ina of Spain, starting her queenship under a bomb attack, ending it in Swiss exile, Alexandra of Russia, remembered only as Rasputin's puppet instead of as a grieving mother, and Queen Mary of Teck, who lived through 2 world wars and multiple monarchs, but today exists mostly as a stiff photograph in a history book. That's the pattern, isn't it? These queens were always adjacent to history, close enough to touch it, but rarely allowed to shape it. They were tools of diplomacy, wombs for heirs, symbols of dynastic pride. And when they fulfilled that function, or failed at it, they were cast aside. History books like bold characters. They like conquerors, warriors, rebels. They like queens who seize power like Elizabeth Var, or queens who cause scandal like Marie Antoinette. But quiet queens? Loyal queens? Patient queens? They slip through the cracks. They don't make for dramatic headlines, so they don't make it into memory. And that's why it feels so haunting to talk about them at night, because their stories aren't gone. They're just muffled, waiting for someone to speak them aloud again. Picture those old portraits in museums. A queen in a stiff gown, pearls around her neck, eyes staring off somewhere beyond the canvas. People walk past her, maybe glance at the label, then move on. She's just wife of so-and-so. But in her time she had thoughts, fears, hopes. She woke up in cold palaces, endured court gossip, whispered prayers for her children. She was real, she was alive. And tonight we've let some of them breathe again. Now, before we close, there's a quiet irony worth noting. Many of these forgotten queens lived long lives. Longer than their husbands, longer than their enemies, sometimes longer than the countries they once ruled. Catherine of Aragon outlived the women who replaced her. Anne of Cleves lived to see her ex-husband and his next queens buried. Queen Adelaide survived her husband William IV and lived into Queen Victoria's reign. Longevity didn't equal memory. They lived, they endured, but still, history walked away. Maybe that's the secret lesson hidden in their stories. That memory is fickle. That history is written less by what happened and more by what people choose to remember. And if you weren't dramatic or scandalous or visibly powerful, history quietly sets you down and walks past. But here's the comfort. Forgotten doesn't mean erased. Their lives still mattered. They shaped dynasties in invisible ways. They mothered heirs, they bridged kingdoms. They softened cruel kings, they steadied trembling crowns. They mattered even if the textbooks disagree. So as you close your eyes tonight, think of those queens, not the dazzling famous ones, but the quiet ghosts in the background. Agnes, Isabella, Anne, Catherine, Amelie, Ina, Alexandra. The ones history forgot. Imagine their crowns gathering dust in dark vaults, their portraits hanging silently in forgotten halls, their names waiting on the edge of memory. And maybe, just maybe, whisper one of their names to yourself before sleep. Because for one night in this quiet, drifting story, they're not forgotten, they're remembered. Now before we close, there's a quiet irony worth noting. Many of these forgotten queens lived long lives, longer than their husbands, longer than their enemies, sometimes longer than the countries they once ruled. Catherine of Aragon outlived the women who replaced her. Anne of Cleves lived to see her ex-husband and his next queens buried. Queen Adelaide survived her husband William IV and lived into Queen Victoria's reign. Longevity didn't equal memory. They lived, they endured, but still, history walked away. Maybe that's the secret lesson hidden in their stories. That memory is fickle. That history is written less by what happened and more by what people choose to remember. And if you weren't dramatic or scandalous or visibly powerful, history quietly sets you down and walks past. But here's the comfort. Forgotten doesn't mean erased. Their lives still mattered. They shaped dynasties in invisible ways. They mothered heirs, they bridged kingdoms. They softened cruel kings, they steadied trembling crowns. They mattered, even if the textbooks disagree. So as you close your eyes tonight, think of those queens. Not the dazzling, famous ones, but the quiet ghosts in the background. Agnes, Isabella, Anne, Catherine, Amelie, Ina, Alexandra. The ones history forgot. Imagine their crowns gathering dust in dark vaults, their portraits hanging silently in forgotten halls, their names waiting on the edge of memory. The almost queens are nearly forgotten consorts. Sometimes the most forgotten queens aren't the ones who ruled briefly, but the ones who never quite got there. Women who were on the cusp of a crown, who married princes that never lived long, enough to inherit, or who found themselves shuffled aside at the last minute. They existed in a strange twilight between future queen and historical footnote. Let's float through a few of them. Take Princess Charlotte of Wales. She wasn't a queen, technically. She was supposed to be. She was the beloved, only child of George IV, back when he was still just a disaster in waiting known as the Prince Regent. Charlotte was smart, witty, and surprisingly popular with the people, who weren't overly fond of her vain, gluttonous father. She married Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg, a man who actually seemed to love her. Rare in this whole history of marriages business. For a moment it looked like Britain would have a fresh, promising queen. And then she died in childbirth at just 21. The grief was enormous. The monarchy scrambled to replace her by marrying off her uncles, one of whom fathered Queen Victoria. So Charlotte was erased, not by failure, but by bad luck and a dangerous medical system. Her queen-in-waiting, remembered briefly, then quietly sidelined, or consider Louise of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, who married the Prussian king Frederick William III. She wasn't exactly forgotten in her own time. She was adored for her beauty, elegance, and her courage when Napoleon invaded. She even begged Napoleon to spare her kingdom, which he didn't, because of course he didn't. But after her death, her reputation became more of a nationalist symbol than an actual story. The woman herself, the private Louise, the mother, the thinker, faded under layers of patriotic myth. She became an image, not a person, and once the myth cooled, her name slipped into obscurity outside of Germany. Then there's Stephanie de Beauharnais, the adopted daughter of Napoleon. Imagine that, being adopted by the most arrogant emperor in Europe and married off to become the Grand Duchess of Baden. She wore crowns, yes, but only because Napoleon decided she should. And when his empire collapsed, so did her spotlight. She lived quietly, raising her children, outliving the empire that had propped her up. Today, most people wouldn't even recognize her name. She was a queen in everything but title, erased because the man who gave her power lost his own. And how about Maria Antonia of Naples, who became Holy Roman Empress by marrying Emperor Leopold? Too, she was Marie Antoinette's sister, but unlike Antoinette, she left barely a trace in the wider world. No dramatic trial, no guillotine, no major scandal. Just a queen consort who did her duty, birthed 16 children, because of course she did, and then died quietly. 16 children should be enough to etch someone into memory, but apparently not. The world remembers the sister, not her. Finally, there's the particularly ghostly figure of Clotilde of France, daughter of Louis XV. She was married off to the future King of Sardinia, Charles Emmanuel IV. When he actually became king, she technically became queen, but he reigned only a few years before abdicating in grief after her death. Clotilde was known for her piety, so much so that she was beatified by the Catholic Church. Yet outside of certain religious circles, her name barely rings a bell. She's a queen who became a saint in theory, but history had no room to keep her alive in memory. All these women existed in that hazy in-between. They weren't queens in the dramatic sense. No Elizabeth Firm, no Catherine the Great. They didn't leave behind scandals, uprisings, or bloody wars. They left behind quieter legacies. A child who mattered, a treaty signed, a moment of dignity, in front of a conqueror. But the pages of history don't cling to quiet legacies. If you think about it, that might be the softest tragedy of all. Not being hated, not being infamous, not even being pitied. Just being faint. Like a candle that burned low in the corner of a very large, very noisy room. The light was there. It mattered to the people nearby. But eventually, it went out, and no one noticed except those who had already left. So tonight, as we let our thoughts slow, we can let them float gently over these faint queens, not rulers, not failures, just people who almost wore history's crown but were brushed aside when louder events filled the stage. And maybe that's a good place to stop, on the thought that behind every famous name there's a chorus of quieter ones. Queens who almost ruled, consorts who were almost remembered, shadows that once were women, and now they've kept you company just a little while longer tonight. The royal children history, misplaced. Royal children were supposed to be the future. Every cradle in a palace came with hopes of an empire resting on it. But many of those cradles became tombs, or their little heirs grew up into irrelevance. They were remembered for a season, then set aside while louder figures filled the stage. Tonight we'll drift slowly through some of those small, almost forgotten lives. Let's start with Prince John of the United Kingdom. He was the youngest, son of King George I and Queen Mary, and he was born into a family already heavy with duty. But John had epilepsy and developmental issues, and in an age where royalty had little patience for imperfection, he was quietly hidden away. His siblings went on to wear crowns and wave from balconies. John lived in relative isolation on a country estate, with only a few companions, until he died at age 13. For his family, he was both loved and tucked out of sight. Today he's remembered faintly as the lost prince, a life overshadowed by expectations he could never meet, or take Don Carlos of Spain, the son of Philip II. He was technically next in line to rule one of the greatest empires on earth, but his story unraveled into something closer to a whispered cautionary tale. He suffered from severe mental and physical health problems, the result of generations of Habsburg inbreeding. Reports describe him as unstable, violent, even cruel to servants and animals. His father eventually locked him away, where he died, young under mysterious circumstances. The official line was natural causes, but most assumed otherwise. Either way, Spain's great hope turned into another historical shadow. Then there's Louis, the Grand Dauphin of France, son of Louis XIV. Imagine being the child of the Sun King, the most flamboyant monarch in Europe. You'd think destiny had a glittering crown waiting for you. Instead, Louis lived most of his life in his father's shadow, never allowed to rule, never really respected. He was described as lazy, fond of food and drink, and entirely uninterested in politics. He died before his father, meaning the crown skipped him entirely and went straight to his son. A whole life of waiting for a throne that never arrived. And let's not forget Princess Henrietta of England, the youngest daughter of Charles I. She was born during a civil war, carried across the sea as a child, and raised in exile. When she grew up, she married the Duke of Orléans, brother of Louis XIV. Henrietta became a kind of side character in French court life, always there but never central. She died young, likely poisoned, though no one could quite prove it. In the flurry of greater dramas, the English Civil War, the execution of her father, the splendor of Versailles, her name slipped almost entirely out of the main narrative. Another faint figure is Crown Prince Rudolph of Austria, son of Emperor Franz Joseph and Empress Elizabeth. He was intelligent, charming, and full of ideas about liberal reform, but he was trapped in the stiff, crumbling empire of the late 19th century. His private life unraveled, his marriage soured, and his health declined. Finally, he died in the infamous Mayerling incident alongside his mistress. Officially a tragedy, unofficially a reminder of how even heirs can crumble under pressure. The Austro-Hungarian throne passed on without him, and history reduced him to a sad footnote. And then Prince Gustav of Sweden, known as the Forgotten Prince. He was the son of Gustav IV Adolf, who was deposed in a coup. When his father lost the throne, little Gustav lost everything too. He grew up in exile, wandering Europe, living in borrowed courts and rented houses. For a time, people whispered about restoring him, but nothing came of it. He died quietly, remembered more by genealogists than by nations. A child meant to be a king, turned into a drifter with a royal name. If you listen closely through all these stories, you notice the same rhythm. Royal children weren't always princes in shining portraits, or girls in jeweled gowns. Often they were frail, sick, unstable, or simply unlucky. Dynasties placed impossible weight on their shoulders, and when they bent or broke, history sighed, turned the page, and moved on. We're left with shadows: John hidden away, Carlos locked up, Louis overshadowed, Henrietta overlooked, Rudolph broken, Gustav forgotten, each a candle snuffed early, or a flame that never caught. And maybe that's why their stories feel so quiet now. They aren't the rulers we remember in textbooks. They're the dreams that faded before they could wake. So tonight, as your eyelids grow heavier, let these children's names drift like faint stars across your thoughts. Too dim to guide sailors, too faint to write poems about, but still glowing softly in the background of history's sky. The Royal Children History Misplaced. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're still awake at this point, I have to say I'm impressed. If not, well, you'll dream of crowns and powdered wigs while this quietly streams in the background. Either way, tonight we're moving into another corner of forgotten royalty. We've floated through neglected queens, sidelined consorts, and wives married off to dynasties that never let them near real power. But what about the children? Royal children were supposed to be the golden hope of every dynasty. They were dressed up in miniature crowns, posed for portraits in silks and satins, and promised a glittering future. But history had a way of shrugging them off. Some were too sickly, some were too unstable, some were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. And as always with royalty, their entire existence boiled down to one question: were they useful to the dynasty or not? If not, they quietly disappeared into exile or illness or just historical oblivion. So tonight let's drift through a few of those children who never quite lived up to the hype. Not always through their own fault, of course. And we'll take our time, because bedtime history is best served slow. Prince John of the United Kingdom. We'll start with Prince John, perhaps the most famous, hidden child in modern royal memory. John was the youngest son of King George V and Queen Mary, the same George and Mary who were the grandparents of Queen Elizabeth II. So yes, we're in relatively recent history here, at least compared to medieval dynasties. John was born in 1905, the last of his siblings. He came into the world already at a disadvantage. His parents were exhausted from raising 5 other children, and the family as a whole wasn't exactly known for their warm, hands-on parenting style. Let's just say George V was not the kind of dad to read bedtime stories. His idea of child-rearing was more in line with keep quiet, stand up straight, and don't embarrass the crown. But John was different. By age 4, it was clear he wasn't developing like his siblings. He had learning difficulties, and soon epileptic seizures began. In a royal family obsessed with appearances and duty, John became what they quietly labeled a problem. So the solution? Move him out of sight. John was sent to live in the countryside at a house called Wood Farm on the Sandringham estate. It wasn't exactly a prison. He had a garden, a few ponies, some trusted caregivers, and even a friend or two. But it was also clear that he was being tucked away. His siblings visited occasionally, but John's life became increasingly separate from the rest of the royal family. The public barely knew he existed. When he died in 1919 at just 13 years old, the newspapers treated it like a small side note. The royal family put on a show of mourning, but privately some of them expressed relief that the problem was gone. It's a harsh truth. Prince John was loved in small ways, but also hidden, brushed aside, and in the end remembered mostly as an inconvenience. Today people sometimes call him the Lost Prince. His story is often framed as tragic, and it is, but it's also telling. Even in the 20th century, when monarchies were supposed to be modernizing, the old rules still applied. If you weren't a perfect heir, history had no space for you. Don Carlos of Spain. Now, if Prince John's story was quietly sad, Don Carlos of Spain was, well, loud, chaotic, and more than a little disturbing. Carlos was the only son of King Philip II of Spain, the same Philip who sent the Spanish Armada against England. So, yes, we're back in the 16th century, and back into the land of the Habsburgs, who, as we know, were about as genetically experimental as a science fair gone wrong. Carlos was the living result of that inbreeding. His parents were double first cousins, which is already not great. His grandparents were also close relatives. The Habsburg chin was practically a family heirloom by this point, and Carlos got it all. The jaw deformities, the frail body, the unstable mind. As a child, he showed violent tendencies. Servants whispered about how he enjoyed harming animals. He flew into rages, broke furniture, and once tried to attack a noble with a sword because he didn't like his outfit. Charming. Physically, he wasn't doing much better. He was small, hunched, with a head described by contemporaries as misshapen. He suffered frequent fevers, headaches, and what we'd probably now diagnose as serious neurological issues. But of course, he was the heir to the biggest empire in the world. Spain stretched from Europe to the Americas to Asia, and this was the boy meant to inherit it. Philip II eventually realized his son was not exactly fit for the job. After a particularly messy series of outbursts, including plotting against his own father, Carlos was locked away in his chambers under guard. He stayed there for 6 months until he conveniently died in 1568 at the age of 23. Officially, it was from natural causes. Unofficially, well, let's just say Philip probably wasn't sad to tick unstable son off his to-do list. Carlos became something of a legend. Some later writers painted him as a tragic figure, a prisoner of his cruel father. Others called him a dangerous madman. Either way, he's remembered more as a cautionary tale about inbreeding than as a serious heir. His reign never came, and Spain probably breathed a sigh of relief. Louis, the Grand Dauphin of France. Now let's glide over to France and meet Louis, the Grand Dauphin. the eldest son of Louis XIV, the famous Sun King. You might think being the child of the most glittering monarch in Europe would set you up for success. But actually it was more like being cast as the understudy in a play where the main actor refuses to ever retire. Louis XIV reigned for 72 years, the longest in European history. By the time he finally died in 1715, 3 generations of heirs had already died waiting for him. The Grand Dauphin was one of them. Born in 1661, he was supposed to be the perfect heir, strong, handsome, ready to carry on the Bourbon dynasty. Instead, he grew up into a man described as, let's say, easygoing if we're being kind. Less kindly, he was seen as lazy, gluttonous, and not particularly bright. He loved hunting, feasting, and collecting art, but showed little interest in politics. Louis XIV, who micromanaged everything from wars to wallpaper, wasn't about to let his son share any real power. The Grand Dauphin spent his entire life essentially sidelined. He married, had children, and played the part of heir, but never ruled a single day. In 1711, he caught smallpox and died at the age of 49, 4 years before his father. It was the ultimate royal anticlimax. The Sun King had overshadowed him so completely that some contemporaries joked that France didn't even notice when he died. The crown skipped him entirely and went straight to his son, who became Louis XV. So the Grand Dauphin is remembered not as a ruler, but as a man who spent his life waiting for a job he never got. A professional heir, a footnote in the shadow of his father's endless reign. Princess Henrietta of England. Let's shift to a softer story now. Princess Henrietta of England, the youngest daughter of Charles I, was born in 1644 during the English Civil War. Her father was fighting for his throne. Her mother fled into exile, and baby Henrietta's life began in chaos. As a toddler, she was smuggled out of England to France, where her mother was already living. She grew up at the French court, surrounded by cousins and courtiers, but always slightly out of place. England was supposed to be her home, but England had executed her father, abolished the monarchy, and didn't exactly have room for an exiled princess. When she grew up, Henrietta married Philippe, Duke of Orléans, the younger brother of Louis XIV. Philippe was flamboyant, dramatic, and very much uninterested in his wife. Their marriage was rocky, full of affairs and arguments, but Henrietta still managed to carve out a role at Versailles. She became a favorite of Louis XIV himself, not romantically, but as a charming, witty companion who helped negotiate treaties and keep court life lively. But her story ended young. In 1670, at just 26 years old, Henrietta suddenly fell ill after drinking a glass of iced chicory water. Within hours she was dead. Rumors spread immediately. Poison. Many suspected her husband's entourage given the messy state of their marriage. An autopsy declared it was peritonitis. Historians still argue. Henrietta's death shocked the French court, but history moved on quickly. She became another lost princess, remembered more for her sudden death than for her life. In the middle of the grandeur of Versailles, she faded into the background. The forgotten brothers and sisters of royalty, welcome back. If you're still with me, you've now survived hours of bedtime history, or maybe you've drifted in and out of sleep, waking up here and there to catch random lines about epileptic princes, overfed heirs, or queens locked in chilly castles. Either way, I'm glad you're here. Tonight we're turning our focus to the people who stood closest to the throne, but never sat on it. We're talking about royal siblings, the brothers and sisters of kings and queens. They had the bloodline, the titles, the riches, but not the crown. Some were loyal allies, others jealous rivals, and a few were so dangerous that their crowned sibling had to lock them up or cut them down. Yet history tends to blur them into the background, so let's pull them back into the candlelight for a while. Elizabeth of York's brothers, the princes in the Tower. Let's begin with a mystery. You probably know of the princes in the Tower. Young Edward V of England and his little brother Richard, Duke of York. Sons of King Edward IV, they were heirs to the throne after their father's sudden death in 1483. At first, everything seemed secure. Edward V, at just 12 years old, was proclaimed king, but his uncle, Richard of Gloucester, had other ideas. He whisked the boys into the Tower of London, supposedly for their protection before Edward's coronation. Weeks passed. No coronation came. Instead, their uncle declared them illegitimate, took the crown himself as Richard III, and the boys vanished. What happened to them remains one of history's greatest cold cases. Were they smothered by guards under Richard's orders? Poisoned in their sleep? Did they die of illness, locked away and forgotten? Or did someone else, Henry Tudor perhaps, finish the job later on? We may never know. What we do know is that the princes never came out of the Tower. Their sister, Elizabeth of York, survived, went on to marry Henry VII and gave birth to Henry VIII. But the boys became shadows in the stone walls, remembered only as the children who should have been kings, and instead disappeared into legend. Arthur, Prince of Wales, Henry VIII's forgotten brother. Now everyone knows Henry VIII. 6 wives, 2 beheadings, endless feasts, and the man who dragged England out of the Catholic Church. But Henry wasn't supposed to be king. That role belonged to his older brother Arthur, Prince of Wales. Arthur was born in 1486, the great hope of the new Tudor dynasty. He was named after the legendary King Arthur, a symbol of strength and legitimacy. From birth, he was trained to be king. Tutors, ceremonies, even a marriage arranged to secure England's alliance with Spain. His bride? Catherine of Aragon, yes, the same woman who would later become Henry VIII's first wife. Arthur and Catherine were married in 1501, when he was 15 and she was 16. They spent just a few months together at Ludlow Castle before Arthur suddenly fell gravely ill. Some say it was sweating sickness, others tuberculosis. Either way, he died in April 1502, just a teenager. England was stunned. The perfect heir was gone, and the crown shifted onto the head of his younger brother Henry. Catherine was left a widow, and within a few years became Henry's wife instead, which, as you can imagine, set off a chain reaction that changed the course of English history forever. If Arthur had lived, Henry VIII would never have been king. No Reformation, no Church of England, no wives lined up like chess pieces. In a sense, Arthur is the ghost behind every major decision of Henry's reign. He's the brother who should have ruled, and whose early death rewrote history. Anne of Cleves' sister, Sibylle, the match that wasn't. Sometimes forgotten siblings weren't just political leftovers. They were bargaining chips in Europe's marriage market. Take Sibylle of Cleves, sister of Anne of Cleves, who famously became Henry VIII's 4th wife. Originally, when Henry was shopping for a new bride, portraits of both Sibylle and Anne were sent to England. Holbein, the court painter, was dispatched to capture their likenesses. Henry, as usual, picked based on the painting and chose Anne. Unfortunately for Anne, the real-life meeting didn't live up to Henry's expectations. He complained that she looked nothing like her portrait, called her a Flanders mare, and the marriage lasted just 6 months. But what about Sibylle, the sister who wasn't chosen? She stayed in Cleves, married John Frederick, Elector of Saxony, and ended up playing a central role in the Protestant Reformation. While Anne became a sidelined ex-queen in England, Sibylle was supporting her husband's fight against the Holy Roman Emperor. She led negotiations, rallied supporters, and even endured imprisonment when the emperor's forces captured her city. So here's the twist. Anne of Cleves may be remembered as the rejected wife, but her sister Sibylle actually lived the life of political power and danger, yet history barely mentions her name. Prince Andrew of Greece, the wandering exile fast forward to the early 20th century, and we find another royal sibling pushed to the sidelines, Prince Andrew of Greece, younger brother of King Constantine. Born into the Greek royal family, which, like most European dynasties, was really just a branch of the extended family tree of Queen Victoria, Andrew was raised with military ambitions. He served in the Balkan Wars, fought in World War I, and tried to carve out a respectable role for himself. But Greek politics were a storm. Kings were overthrown, restored, and overthrown again. After a disastrous military campaign in Asia Minor, Andrew was blamed for disobeying orders and nearly executed. Instead, he was exiled, stripped of his titles and forced to live in France. His life dwindled into poverty and obscurity. His marriage to Princess Alice of Battenberg, herself later remembered as the mother of Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, collapsed under strain. Andrew lived apart from his family, isolated, and died in Monte Carlo in 1944, far from the throne his brother had once held. His son, Philip, would marry Elizabeth II and help reshape the modern British monarchy. But Andrew himself is remembered, if at all, as the failed brother, a man who belonged to royalty but had no kingdom left to serve. Madame Elizabeth, sister of Louis XV. Finally, let's stop at the French Revolution, where kings and queens lost their heads, and so did their siblings. Madame Elizabeth, younger sister of King Louis XVII, grew up in Versailles surrounded by every luxury. She was pious, loyal, and deeply attached to her brother. When the revolution broke out, Elizabeth refused to abandon the royal family. She stayed by Louis, Marie Antoinette, and their children through imprisonment, humiliation, and trial. After the king was executed in 1793, Elizabeth continued caring for Marie Antoinette and her young nephew, the little Louis XVI. But in 1794, the guillotine came for her too. At just 30 years old, she was executed during the height of the Reign of Terror. Unlike her brother and sister-in-law, she left no husband, no children, no legacy, just a memory of quiet loyalty in the face of chaos. History barely whispers her name. Yet in her final moments she was calm, even serene, consoling others on the scaffold. The forgotten sister of the doomed king. And so, as we drift to the end of Part 10, we're left with a thought. Kings and queens may glitter in history books, but their siblings often lived equally dramatic lives, sometimes tragic, sometimes heroic, sometimes pitiful, only to be erased by the shadow of the crown. Royalty, after all, was a ruthless spotlight. It shone on one person, and one person only. Everyone else stood just outside its glow, half seen, half remembered, waiting for history to call their name. The queens who wore crowns but not power. Hey guys, welcome back. If you're still here after 10 parts of historical meandering, you either really love history or you've fallen asleep to the sound of my voice, which, honestly, was the whole point. Tonight we're gliding through the lives of queens who had all the ceremony of monarchy, but almost none of the actual ruling authority. They're the ones who wore crowns, signed their names in fancy scripts, appeared on coins or at coronations, and then quietly faded into the background while their husbands, brothers, or advisors actually ran things. Forgotten, overlooked, and sometimes tragically symbolic, they're the wallpaper of royal history. So dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's wander into the faded corridors where these sidelined queens once stood. Anne of Bohemia, the queen who did nothing on purpose. Let's start with Anne of Bohemia, wife of Richard II of England. Now, Richard himself is remembered as a spectacularly unpopular king, moody, extravagant, and eventually overthrown by his cousin Henry IV. But Anne, well, Anne is mostly remembered for not doing much at all. She was married to Richard in 1382 as part of a political alliance. She was about 16, he was 15. Their marriage was childless, but by all accounts they were genuinely affectionate. Richard adored her, spoiled her, even built her a fancy palace in her honor. The English people, however, weren't thrilled. She brought no dowry, no money, no political advantage. To them, she was a useless queen. Anne didn't meddle in politics, didn't plot, didn't push her husband toward war or reform. She mainly existed as a softening influence on Richard, smoothing his temper and trying to calm his more extravagant impulses. When she died young at just 28, Richard was devastated. He ordered whole buildings torn down just because she had once lived in them. It was one of the few times the people actually sympathized with him. So here's Anne's legacy. The Queen, who did nothing but love her husband, and somehow became slightly beloved for it. Not exactly a ruler, not exactly remembered, just a quiet presence in the shadow of a disastrous reign. Christina of Denmark, the queen who said no thanks to Henry VIII, or next almost queen, is Christina of Denmark, who technically never even made it to the English throne, but she's worth mentioning because she nearly did. After Henry VIII dumped Anne of Cleves, he was once again on the hunt for a new wife. One of the candidates was young Christina, Duchess of Milan. She was about 16, beautiful, and politically connected. Holbein was sent to paint her portrait, which still survives, by the way, showing a striking girl in black with a sharp, knowing look. Christina, however, wasn't exactly thrilled about the idea of marrying Henry, and who could blame her? By that point he was obese, ulcer-ridden, and had a reputation for chopping off his wives' heads. When asked about the proposal, she supposedly said, "If I had 2 heads, one should be at the King of England's disposal." It was a polite way of saying absolutely not. Christina never married Henry, and instead went on to live a relatively calm life in Europe, marrying into the House of Lorraine. She never ruled as queen anywhere, but she holds the unusual honor of being the woman who wisely dodged Henry's matrimonial firing squad. Isabella of Valois, the child bride. Queen. Now let's float back to England for a moment, because poor Richard II, the one married to Anne of Bohemia, had another wife after Anne died. And this one was Isabella of Valois, a French princess who became queen at the tender age of 6. Yes, 6 years old. Richard was about 29 at the time. The marriage was a peace treaty between England and France, meant to put an end to the 100 Years' War. Of course, it didn't actually end the war, but it did create one of the strangest royal pairings in history. Isabella lived in England as a ceremonial child queen. She and Richard weren't husband and wife in any real sense. He treated her more like a daughter. She was given a household, attendants, and plenty of pomp, but no power whatsoever. When Richard was overthrown and imprisoned in 1399, Isabella was just 9 years old. The new king, Henry IV, wanted to marry her to his son to cement legitimacy, but Isabella flat out refused. She demanded to go back to France, where she eventually remarried into her own dynasty. She died young, only 19, but she left behind a memory of strength. the little girl who was forced into queenship and still managed to say no when it mattered. Catherine Parr, the queen who outlived Henry VIII by now. You've probably noticed Henry VIII keeps showing up in these stories. That's because he left behind a trail of queens who were technically crowned, but barely got to rule. One of the most interesting was his sixth and final wife, Catherine Parr. Catherine was older, widowed twice, and far more educated than Henry's previous wives. She was also practical. She knew what marrying Henry meant, risk, danger, and possibly death, but she also saw an opportunity to use the position to her advantage. As queen, Catherine Parr actually had some influence. She pushed for the education of Henry's daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, which would later prove crucial. She also acted as regent when Henry went to war in France, signing royal documents and even raising funds for the crown. But mostly, her reign was survival. Henry turned on her once, accusing her of heresy, but she cleverly talked her way out of it, claiming she only argued with him to distract him from his pain. In other words, "Of course I let you win, darling." Catherine outlived Henry, making her the only one of his wives to do so. She later remarried for love, though in true Tudor fashion even that ended tragically when she died giving birth. She wore the crown, but her power was always conditional on her ability to keep her husband happy, which somehow she managed. Marie-Thérèse of France, the queen who never ruled, and finally. Let's slip into the 19th century with Marie-Thérèse Charlotte of France, the daughter of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. She technically became Queen of France in 1830 for a grand total of 20 minutes. Marie-Thérèse had lived through the Revolution, imprisonment, and the execution of her parents. She was the only surviving child of the royal family, scarred and hardened by trauma. She eventually married her cousin Louis-Antoine, Duke of Angoulême, who became heir to the French throne under the Bourbon Restoration. When his father abdicated during the July Revolution of 1830, Louis-Antoine became king. And since he was married to Marie-Thérèse, that made her queen. The problem? Louis-Antoine immediately abdicated too after just 20 minutes. They were both swept aside by the revolutionaries, and Marie-Thérèse's queenship ended almost as soon as it began. Her entire life had been a grim story of survival, exile, and disappointment. To have finally reached the throne, only to lose it instantly, feels like the cruelest historical joke. She is remembered today as the 20-minute queen. And that's where we'll pause for part 11. We've wandered through child brides, sidelined consorts, reluctant survivors, and even a queen who only reigned for less time than it takes to brew a pot of tea. Each one wore the crown, but none of them ever truly ruled. Their lives remind us that queenship wasn't always power. Sometimes it was just performance, obligation, or a cruel twist of dynastic fate. Queens who ruled behind the curtain. Hey guys, welcome back. If you've made it this far, congratulations. You're now officially more patient than most monarchs ever were with their mistresses, advisors, or really anyone who disagreed with them. Tonight we're gliding into a softer category of queens, the ones who weren't officially in charge but somehow quietly, inconveniently were. They didn't always have thrones. They didn't always sign laws, but they were there behind the curtain, whispering in the ears of kings, pulling the strings of ministers, and sometimes shaping entire dynasties while pretending to just sit quietly with their embroidery hoops. So, dim the lights, settle in, and let's drift into the world of hidden queenship. Eleanor of Aquitaine, the woman who outlived everyone we have to start with Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the few medieval queens who made an art form out of being both visible and invisible at the same time. Eleanor began life as the Duchess of Aquitaine, one of the wealthiest heiresses in Europe. She married King Louis VII of France, got bored of him, and then, in a move that would make a Netflix drama look tame, divorced him and married the future Henry II of England. Yes, she went from Queen of France to Queen of England, because why not? Now here's the twist. While Henry II tried his best to keep Eleanor sidelined, she was no passive queen. She managed her own lands, funded troubadours, and even supported her sons in rebellion against their father. At one point, Henry actually imprisoned her for over a decade, which sounds extreme but was basically the medieval version of sending your wife on a very long spa retreat without the spa. And yet, when Henry died, Eleanor came roaring back into political life. She arranged marriages, negotiated treaties, and acted as regent for her son, Richard the Lionheart, while he was off crusading. She even continued to advise her youngest son, King John. Yes, the same John who gave us the Magna Carta. Eleanor lived into her 80s, which in the 12th century was like being 150 today. She never officially ruled in her own right, but honestly, for half a century, she was the power behind two thrones. Margaret of Anjou, the she-wolf who ran England anyway, moving forward. A few centuries we arrive at Margaret of Anjou, wife of Henry VI of England, and Henry. Well, Henry wasn't exactly the most energetic king. He had periods of mental illness, long bouts of passivity, and a general habit of letting stronger personalities take over. Enter Margaret. Fierce, ambitious, and politically ruthless, she essentially became the de facto ruler whenever Henry couldn't function, which unfortunately for him was often. Margaret wasn't content to just smile and wave. She actively led armies during the Wars of the Roses, directed court politics, and even arranged brutal executions of her enemies. Shakespeare later dubbed her the she-wolf of France, which wasn't exactly meant as a compliment, but it gets the point across. Of course, the irony is that her efforts all collapsed. She lost her son, her crown, and eventually her freedom. She ended her days in relative obscurity back in France, but for a while Margaret was England's most powerful ruler, without ever officially being one. Catherine de Medici, the mother who controlled France. Now let's drift over to Renaissance France, where Catherine de Medici perfected the art of queenship without ruling. She married King Henry II of France, but when he died in a jousting accident, her children became successive kings. Catherine, however, stayed firmly in control. As Queen Mother, she served as regent for her young sons, but even after they technically came of age, she remained their advisor/puppet master. Catherine was cunning, politically savvy, and, let's be honest, a little terrifying. She's most infamous for her supposed role in the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572, when thousands of Protestants were slaughtered in Paris. Historians still debate how much of it was her idea versus just her inability to stop it. But either way, her reign from the shadows left France drenched in blood. At the same time, Catherine was also a patron of the arts. She brought Italian style and cuisine to France, introduced new fashions, and commissioned elaborate architecture. So she could arrange a banquet one day and a massacre the next. A true multitasker. She never wore the official crown, but for nearly 30 years, Catherine was France's unofficial ruler. Empress Dowager Cixi, the woman who outlasted. Dynasties. Now let's float far from Europe, over to 19th century China, where Empress Dowager Cixi practically redefined what it meant to rule from behind the curtain. Cixi started out as a low-ranking concubine to Emperor Xianfeng of the Qing dynasty. Somehow, against all odds, She caught his eye and bore him a son, which in the Confucian imperial system was basically winning the golden ticket. When the emperor died, her little boy became emperor, and Cixi became regent. And once she got a taste of power, she never let it go. For nearly 50 years, Cixi maneuvered her way through palace coups, uprisings, and foreign invasions. She officially retired when her son came of age, but then mysteriously came back when he conveniently died. Then she retired again when her adopted nephew took the throne, only to take control again when he showed signs of independence. Cixi is often blamed for the decline of the Qing dynasty. She was conservative, slow to modernize, and more interested in maintaining her own control than reforming China. But she was also a survivor. Few women in history managed to cling to power for that long, in that dangerous a system. She wasn't officially the Empress Regnant, but in practice, Cixi was China's ruler, one of the last great autocrats of imperial history, Sophia Dorothea of Celle, the queen who ruled through her absence. And finally, let's end with one of the more ironic cases, Sophia Dorothea of Celle, the wife of George I of Britain. Now, George wasn't exactly the most charming man alive. When he became King of Britain in 1714, he brought with him a string of mistresses and German courtiers. But Sophia Dorothea, she never joined him. She wasn't even allowed to. Why? Because George had locked her away years earlier in Germany after accusing her of adultery. She spent the last 30 years of her life imprisoned in a castle. So how does this count as ruling behind the curtain? Well, because her children and descendants went on to dominate the British throne. Her son became George II. Her granddaughter became Queen Caroline, another behind-the-scenes powerhouse. And in a strange way, Sophia Dorothea's enforced absence only made her presence stronger. She became a tragic symbol of a dynasty built on dysfunction. She never ruled, never even appeared at court, but her bloodline shaped Britain for centuries. Sometimes the shadow is more powerful than the crown, and that's where we'll pause part 12. We've floated through queens who schemed, whispered, manipulated, and occasionally led armies, all without ever being the official monarch. They remind us that queenship wasn't just about crowns and ceremonies. Sometimes the most powerful figure